All right, so we got about 20 people. Let's see how many smiling faces I see on here. Look at that. We got about half for half. We'll see. All right, so let's get started. For those of you who are just joining us, this is we've moved the time just for this week. The contract class will stay Tuesdays at 2. The reason that we did move this one up is we have a regional leadership meeting this afternoon. And I didn't want to skip this week because of the timely information that's in the changes of the contract that started yesterday. There are also a couple of other very small changes in the property disclosure that are effective May 1. It's really small, so I'm just going to send that one out in a quick broker minute video for you guys. So, but we're going to go through the 5 documents that I sent out. If you don't have those in front of you, obviously I'm going to go through them. You can get them from SCR or check your email. You should all have them in your email. But we're going to jump into this. I don't think this will take more than an hour. We gave an hour and a half just in case. The changes, as I was saying, if you're just jumping on, there are a handful of them, but most of them are fairly small changes. So we'll just jump through them. As a point of reference too, the ones that I sent out may be formatted weird because those are the rough drafts from the state. The new ones that are up on the state site today or as of yesterday are all formatted correctly. They just don't have the highlights and everything on there. All right, so first thing we're going to do, can everybody hear me okay? There's some major background noise that just started in construction downstairs, so we'll see how this goes. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to jump on what is form 518, which is the first of the ones that I sent you, and that's the release of contract. And I'm going to share my screen with you here. Make sure I have everything I can see. So give me a thumbs up if you see the contract on your screen. Awesome. So basically the highlighted areas are going to be the changes that are made. This release of contract is different than Form 313. Form 313 is the one that you would use as a unilateral termination, right? So if you, in any parts of the contract, you'd use that. This is actually the release of agreement between the buyer and seller that handles the earnest money. A couple important changes that have been made on this. First one, which some of you will be very relieved for, is in the first paragraph, as you can see, where they struck any third-party beneficiary brokers that need to sign the contract. So the contract actually no longer needs to be signed by the brokers or agents because this release is 100% between the buyer and the seller. It does, however, still protect the brokers and agents as a hold harmless. So when you sign this agreement, this is a full release, right, as it was before. So it's not just releasing the earnest money, it is releasing everyone from the actual contract as well. Okay, so the first change is going to be in this area here. Let me pull down. If you have any questions, by the way, in this, feel free to just either raise your hand, shout out, or type it in the chat box. I'm going to make sure I get the chat box up here so I see it all. Whoops. All right. So first change is in paragraph 1 here. And then the changes down here are the first 3 we already know about. They just make them more formal. And then there's a 4th option on here that's a little different. So the first option that you would have when you do a release is option number 1, all the money goes to the buyer, right? Option number 2, all the money goes to the seller. Or they've basically specified an option 3 where X goes to the buyer and X goes to the seller. Right, so they keep that on there, keeps it uniform, keeps it easy for you on that. You're not practicing law by having to write anything in there. The biggest change on this one comes in option 4, which is this is where parties agree that the contract's terminated. The buyer and seller have said, listen, I'm not selling to you or I'm not buying from you. So we're releasing the actual contract. However, we're disputing the earnest money. And then what this does is it calls the escrow agent to file the appropriate action with court of competent jurisdiction, which is basically where they file whatever information they need to in order for this to move forward. Now, best case scenario is to hire a mediator on this. In SCR, South Carolina Association of Realtors, does have free mediators for this. So that's always an option that will save a little bit of time and money because if they do have to go through the court system, that could end up being kind of costly for the buyer and the seller. Okay, so pretty easy peasy on the changes of this one. No longer need broker signatures. And then they've separated how the money can be divided and then added option 4 here on where you will actually release the contract, but still dispute the earnest money. All right, Questions? Who's got questions? Okay, so good. So Celeste asked a good question. If this comes by itself without the other form you mentioned, which is the termination, does this suffice as the formal termination? Technically, no. However, if I'm a listing agent and a buyer's agent sends me this and we haven't worked it out, that to me is saying, hey, we terminate. Like we're not buying your house anymore. And typically you're asking, I'm assuming the question is coming because, you know, do we try to fight this out to see if we're actually going to close, or can I put the house back on the market? This is probably where that question's coming from. So it can be stated as a termination, but it's not the actual unilateral termination that should be used in any other part of the contract where it talks about that, which will come up a couple times.
I guess arguably though, if a buyer has signed this, then you could go ahead back on the market because they've said we don't want this property anymore.
Yes. So my opinion as your broker, as a listing agent, when you receive this, I mean, I have a conversation first if it just comes out of nowhere. But if you've received this and the buyer's saying I'm not selling, at this point, it's our obligation to put the house back on the market to find a seller. Now, you always run the risk of if another buyer comes in and the buyer hasn't officially terminated by signing this release, the seller just has to know that there's still a risk until you have this release signed that there's still an issue, which is why option 4 has been put on here to say, hey, you know, fine, we'll release the contract, but we're still fighting for the earnest money. Now, on the flip side, and again, I'm not an attorney, should this be signed and then you want to fight for your earnest money as a buyer, you lose a lot of leverage when this is signed, because at that point you've released the seller. But at the end of the day, you're never going to sue a seller to make you sell the house to them. I mean, you can. The chances of that going through, I don't know, would be worth the battle. Okay. Any other questions on this one? Good question. All right. So let's jump to the second form that I sent out to you, which is going to be Form 504, which has had a lot of changes. They all make sense though, so don't let it intimidate you. So Form 504 is the buyer's sale contingency. This is the form that will be included, should be included with an offer that's contingent on a buyer's home selling. Okay, so at the top it describes what it's being attached to. It's either going to be Form 310 or 300. 310 is the one we use the most of the time. And then this really starts to map out a couple of different things that are important that we all wanted to know in Form 504. Basically, the Forms Committee put all this in writing. So the first part of it's obviously, let's just say as an example, you've got buyer that's coming from Florida to purchase a home. And the reason I say that, I'm gonna say Florida house is their home that they're selling. Charleston house is the home that they're buying. Okay, so in the top paragraph, you'd put Florida house here. Obviously, that's not restricted to just the state of Florida. You'd use this in any house if it were the neighbor's house. So they're going to put the house in Florida on here, that the house that they have to sell in order to purchase this contract. Zoom this in. And then you start to specify where you are in that position, or excuse me, with that property. First part says the property is or is not currently under contract, and the ratified redacted contract is or is not attached. If property is currently under contract, buyer will deliver a completed SC Form 500, which is a new form we're going to cover in a minute, with this. So let's break this sentence down a little bit. First one is, it either is or is not currently under contract. Okay, so if it is, it's currently under contract. If I'm the listing agent, I want a copy of the ratified redacted contract. Redacted means a contract with any personal information removed. The only thing that contract really needs is seller signatures, closing date, and any pertinent contingencies, right? Block everything else out. If it's not attached, I'd want to know why as the listing agent. Okay, because obviously I want to have the evidence on there. Second sentence is the property listed on, if it has been, blank date by blank brokerage firm and is not or is listed on the multiple listing service. So again, if this is listed, Another state, is it on the multiple listing service? Who's it listed by? First two, fairly self-explanatory. All right, so this is where the contract changes, or excuse me, Form 504 changes up a little bit, and that is in that it's before it used to have closing within certain days, blah, 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 and it would only have contingent on it closing on a certain date. So this is separated to two separate actions that have to happen on the Florida house. First one is the day it needs to go under contract, and then the second one is the day it needs to close. Okay, so this paragraph right here basically covers the first part, which says the property must be under contract no later than this date. The reason they put that on here is because what happened with the old 504 is it got a little confusing, because let's just say you had a closing date of April 30th, right? Well, we all know that the house, if it's not under contract today, it ain't closing on April 30th, but Form 504 didn't allow the seller to terminate at this point until you actually got to the, hey, it hasn't closed by today. So this basically says there's a date that the buyer must have their home under contract, okay? And then they shall deliver in writing to the sellers a signed completed Form 500, which we're going to go over here in a minute, within 48 hours of ratification of your contract. If the buyer's property is not under contract by this date, then either party may terminate this contract using Form 313. Okay, everybody with me so far? Give me a nod, not as in falling asleep nod, but a nod. Okay, good. Yep, some of you are still with me. Don't worry, the jokes will get better. All right, number two, the sale contingency. This is where it splits. Now we've talked about the day it needs to be under contract. Again, be reasonable on this under contract. I wouldn't make it within any less than 3 to 4 weeks, and I wouldn't make it where it's 60 days out where they have no time to get their home under contract. Now you've got the sale contingency. So this is where the buyer's sale deadline. This contract is contingent upon the marketing closing the buyer's property no later than blank date. This you can put as the same date as the closing date that you had on the original agreement. Okay. The buyer shall within blank days deliver to seller notice that the buyer's property sale has closed. Obviously, this is going to be a small number. There's no reason this should be spread out any more than a couple of days. Now, I would suggest, as the buyer's agent in this, that you keep this as close to, hold on one second. All right, let me make sure I didn't just mute myself. Okay, good. All right, so you want to make sure that this date that you have in here is fairly close to the closing date of your contract. What you don't want to do is have where you represent the buyer, you put the closing date of the home is going to be on today, the 27th, and they're buying their home. It's not closing until May 3rd. If you run out of deadlines to give them notice, you could get yourself in trouble. So I'd keep these dates as close as possible. Okay. So the second part of this, should the sale of the buyer's property not close by the date above, the buyer may terminate this contract by notice to the seller using Form 513. That's what the buyer can do. If the contract on the buyer's property is terminated after the date mentioned above in Section 1, but before the buyer's sale deadline, either party may terminate by delivering notice using South Carolina Form 313. So here's what happens on that. Let's say they make this deadline here, right? They get it under contract, but then it falls through above the date, or excuse me, after this date they made here, but before the buyer's deadline, then either party can terminate the agreement at that point. Okay, they don't have to, they can. As the seller, you're probably gonna want to terminate it if they're not giving enough time. You know, if it gets terminated 3 weeks out from when you're supposed to close, you're probably not going to have time to go back on there. Again, your seller can opt to do that. They could opt to amend this agreement as well. Okay. All right. Should the sale of the buyer's property not close by the date above, the seller may terminate this contract by notice using Form 313, unless the parties agreed on the cash.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Oh, that's all right. Unless the parties agree that they're going to pay cash or that they can finance the property without selling their property. Okay, so the buyer, they do have the option to negotiate that out. And obviously, if your seller wants to take that option, I would do that prior to terminating and having to go back on the market. All right. We're going to keep pushing through, and then obviously we're going to digest it one by one if we need to with any questions. All right, so the second part, if the buyer fails to meet any time frame deadline that's above, either party may terminate the contract by delivering the notice, which is the termination notice form 313. Here are the buyer's duties during all of this. Between this contract's effective date and the buyer sale deadline, the buyer shall make only good faith efforts to sell their property. Timely inform the seller and brokers of pertinent information of the buyer's property. All of this is in the original 504, so I'm going to kind of go through it fairly quickly. Timely direct brokers or law firms to disclose the information. This is where we get a little bit more of an explanation of what happens should a buyer, quote unquote, default or not get their home sold during this time frame. Now, the seller can continue to market the property and may accept up backup offers or backup contract using Form 391. MLS rules may require categorization of the seller's listing other than active. So this doesn't change the fact that if you have a backup contract, or excuse me, if you have a contract contingent on a home selling, you still have to mark it as active contingent. This doesn't change the fact that MLS rules state that. Now, if the seller delivers notice of acceptance of a backup contract, this is a big difference here. It used to be backup offer, it's backup contract now. So if the seller, if you're the listing agent, you negotiate a backup contract, they notify the buyer within blank calendar days, and then the buyer can choose one of the following. Okay, so let's just quickly pause, step out on this and say, okay, here's what it would look like. I'm the listing agent. I've got a contract on my property, on my seller's property. It's contingent using this form here. And then we have someone come in and say, hey, we want to come in and make a backup offer. That's fantastic. But you have to have a backup contract as stated in Form 391, which is for the backup contract, and then have that ratified, negotiated out, and then you give the buyer notice that you have that backup contract in place. Okay. Says, would you put in the MLS with a kickout clause? You could if you had a kickout clause, yes. That's kind of what this is. But it's still, yes, to answer your question, it's a vague kickout clause. It's not like they used to be where it just said 48-hour kickout clause, but yes. So let's jump back onto it. Make sure I got all those questions. Yep. All right. So if you do get a backup contract and you deliver notice, then the buyer should choose one of the following using signed Form 505, which we'll jump into, but basically 505 gives you one of these following things to do. Number one, deliver Form 500, which is showing that the buyer's property is under contract for sale. So this doesn't change. If you get us, if you're a buyer and the buyer's agent and the listing agent says, hey, we've got a backup contract, as long as you can show them that your buyer is currently under contract on their Florida property at this point using that form, then they stay in first position. Or you can remove the sale contingency only if the closing of the buyer's property is not required to obtain purchase money, meaning they can either get 2 mortgages or they can pay cash. The third option is that the buyer can then the current buyer can move into backup position to the new contract, or you can terminate the contract using Form 313. Okay, so those are the 4 options that you have should the seller negotiate a backup contract. If the buyer does not timely perform with A or B, meaning they don't deliver notice that they have a contract on their home, or they remove the sale contingency, then if it does comply, then they remain the first primary contract. If the buyer does not timely or properly comply with A or B, then either party can terminate using Form 313. Okay, so those are the changes. Really quickly, I'll run through them and then we'll ask any questions. Basically talks about whether or not the property is or is not under contract at time of offer, what if the property is currently listed and by whom, when it will be under contract, and then when it will sell by. Those are the big changes as we've gone from vague days or anything like that to specific dates. Those are the big changes on that one. And then if the contract is terminated after the date here, then at that point, the seller can terminate if the home is not under contract, or they can renegotiate a deadline for them to get a new contract on there. And And then we talked about the difference is with the accepted backup contract, there are 4 options, which is basically make sure you're under contract, be able to purchase the home without selling your home, move to the backup position, or terminate. All right, questions about this one? This has got the most changes on here. So this is the one that you may have some questions on.
I have a question,
Yes, sir.
but remember, I'm a new agent, so nobody laugh at me if I haven't done a buyer side yet. I've only done the listing side. But so do you use this form together with the buy and sell real estate?
Yeah, it's
Regular
attached to
offer
it.
form?
So on the front of form 310, when you make an offer, there's it's in paragraph 2, it talks about whether or not it is or is contingent on a home selling, and then whether or not form 504, which is this form, is or is not attached.
Okay.
So it would be along with. It's not required. However, as a listing agent, I'd never advise my clients to accept. I mean, they make the ultimate call, but I would say it's very risky to accept a contract contingent on a home selling without having form 504 attached.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. All right, I guess that means it's covered. So now we're going to jump to form 505, which basically talks about pull this up here. Form 505 is the form that would be used by the seller should they accept a backup offer for a contract. And like all of them, pretty much just walk through it. I know this wasn't one that's been used a lot. However, it maps it out pretty well. So buyer sale contingency, the contract is contingent upon the marketing and closing of the sale of the buyer's property, which was explained in the one we just talked about. The following notice is being delivered to the buyer and brokers as notice created a time frame deadline for buyer to basically select one of the 4 options given to them on form 504. So this is what you would use as the listing agent. Should you have a seller that negotiates a backup contract, you would then send this to the buyer's agent. Okay. Seller notice of options, you'll select the appropriate circle. If the seller has accepted a backup contract and buyer is obligated to select from the following choices to deliver notice to seller and selection within the South Carolina Form 504 timeline, which was specified in the one, and whether or not you're going to submit a redacted subsequent contract is attached. So basically you're just saying, hey, we've got a backup offer, here's the contract, and then you need to perform on one of the 4 options given in form 504, which we'll revisit here and again in a second at the bottom of this page. Now, there could be another option where your seller simply says, we accepted it as a backup offer. However, we would prefer our current offer to stay as primary. Could be better terms. You could be far enough along into it. You're just putting them on notice that there's a backup offer and that they're going to remain as the primary contract. Right now, if they have selected this first part, then basically it goes down and it divides out the 4 options that we said earlier. It kind of actually maps them out into 5 different options on this one, because why keep it consistent? The buyer options to remain the primary contract, they have to do one of these 5. Number 1, attach form 505, or excuse me, 500 with a redacted contract. Again, this is basically saying I, as the buyer, am going to stay as primary because I have a current contract on my house. Now, that may have already happened, right? So if that's the case, then that would be a simple one to check off. Number 2, the buyer removes the sale contingency and verifies that they have pre-final loan approval for closing. Again, pre-final loan approval. Final approval in South Carolina is financing is not until closing, but the pre-final approval saying they can close on the property without selling their house, they can include that. Or the buyer may remove the sale contingency and attach verification of cash for closing. If they do any of those and they remain the primary, if they do not want to remain the primary, then they can agree to become a backup offer using form 391. So they basically would just move their form into their offer into, or contract into second position, or terminate this contract unilaterally with form 313. Okay, so basically this is just the formal way of responding to the options that were given on Form 504. Karen, did you have a question?
I did.
Yeah.
So you'd be filling out both of them? I mean, depending on which side you were on. So I have accepted this offer on my house, and the people have to sell a house.
Correct.
So we've gotten those forms done. Then somebody comes along and gives me a backup offer. I give them official notice this way, and then they have to respond to it. Is that right?
Yes.
I'm not using this official notice if I don't have a house. If you get backup offers all the time.
Correct. Yes. So this is great question. Great clarification. This is only used in with Form 504. Yeah. This
If
is
we got a backup, if we have to sell a
Yes.
house situation. Okay.
Yeah, because it's agreement. Yes, because it references see previously accepted Form 504. Yeah, threw me on that one because I thought, wait a minute, but no, that's a good clarification. Yes. Any other questions? Yes, Celeste.
So under this, the buyer can check the last box and just terminate altogether?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because at this point, the seller, and then be okay for the seller, because the seller's got, this is the big difference on this, is the seller's now got a backup contract versus a backup offer, right? So they have a contract. So if the buyer terminates, their other contract moves into primary position.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, other questions? If you have your hand raised, and I am not calling on you, just speak out in case I'm not seeing you. Okay.
Is there a beginner class for new agents for contracts?
Yeah, so this is just the changes that are happening. Every Tuesday at 2, come to the contracts class. So just as a quick reminder, the format of the contracts class throughout the week, you've got 4 weeks in a month. First one is the buyer side transaction documents. Second is the seller side. And then you've got the general purchase and sale agreement that we do on the 3rd. And then the 4th Tuesday is when we do stuff like this. Any updates, general information. We may dig down on certain areas depending on what's going on. All of the other contract ones, Radisha, are on the YouTube page as well. And we'll make sure we get that out to you. And then obviously in the meantime, should you have any questions about any of these, don't wait till the contract class, call me. Assuming you need it now, right? All right. So let's jump to the next one, which is a new form. Which basically, this is the form that is going to be used with both 504 as well as 505. And this is when this is basically the notice the buyer uses to send to the seller to say, hey, I have an accepted offer on my house in Florida, right? The house that I have to sell. Again, you would send it says right here, if the buyer receives South Carolina 505, then a redacted contract must be attached. Basically, if the seller has formally requested you to send that, you do need to send a copy of the contract. Now it's redacted, again, to remind you on that. Legal terms means no personal information, particularly on the buyer side. You basically, but if I'm the listing agent, I want to see that the seller has accepted it. They have signed it. There are signatures on there. There's a closing date, and then any relevant contingencies. There's no hard and fast definition of redacted that we use on that. So this is the form, easy peasy form here that only the buyer has to sign. It's sent with that contract. Okay. All right. Any questions about these? Because these all kind of go hand in hand with each other as far as for 504, 505, and 500.
Joseph, would
Yes.
this last one, would buyers go to the trouble of submitting that even if they have an offer? For only an offer, I should say?
Say that again.
Contract? Would a buyer go to the trouble of submitting this if they only have an offer as opposed to a contract?
No, you would need a contract.
Okay,
Yeah, you would need a contract on your house. If you're the house in Florida, this is for an actual contract accepted,
okay.
or what they call an accepted offer, which is essentially a contract.
And why wouldn't you attach it? I mean, that's why I wasn't clear.
Why wouldn't you?
Yeah,
Some people may be weird. I mean, there are a lot of people out here that just don't like to send information like that. So this
Okay.
specifically maps out, and that's why it's, you want to advise your buyer that part of their obligation when they do this is they are going to have to send a redacted copy of it. Now, you can exclude the price, right? It doesn't have to have the price on there. It just has to, you'd want the closing date, contingencies, and signatures.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, any other questions? All righty, jumping on to the last one. So basically this last one, to in a nutshell, I mean, I'm going to go through it, but in a nutshell, they've basically finally taken form 330, which is the lot Lakeridge general use one, and they've matched up with 310 that had a lot of updated verbiage on there. I mean, in there, so where I go through this quickly, it's because we cover this a lot in the actual 310 contract one, but I'm just going to show you the areas that are highlighted that have been have been changed just to match the other one with certain protocol items. So this form is used for boat slip, lots, acreage, similar transactions. Again, as anything, they always highlight this. The parties are responsible for obtaining legal advice prior to signing the contract. Should you have any questions outside of the scope of the contract. First change is they've removed this term of business day because we don't use business days in the contracts anymore. They've changed all of Form 330. They've removed all business days and changed them to calendar days. Okay. And then they've added the initials where the customer is going to, or customer or client that they've acknowledged they've received the property, or excuse me, the agency disclosure brochure, and they're choosing to be either a customer or a client of the transaction. Again, just as a side note on this, people ask all the time, which one should I choose? Should I have it be dual agency or designated? That's not ultimately your decision. That is ultimately the client's decision. Jennifer's question, is this updated in DocuSign? It should be this week. These just went into effect yesterday. So if you will, Jennifer, if you'll just go through and make sure you rewrite all your contracts on this new one, that'd be great. I can't see your face. Oh yeah, you look puzzled. Yeah, I'm just kidding. Don't do that. Right. See, sometimes
I did not know that if you were kidding or not.
Yeah, I know, and you have a great poker face. I'm actually kind of nervous. You were like, okay, we'll see. All right, scrolling down.
I'm new too. I'm likely just to do whatever you say.
He'll grow out of that real fast. All right, so next part, again, it talks about it removes the automatic extension of blank business days, which, was something that all of us did, or most people didn't like from the actual original contract. That has been removed in there. This one's kind of important. It's kind of changed on how the property is supposed to be left. Reasonably clean was removed because that was fairly vague. Free of debris. However, it does say seller remove all man-made items from the property unless otherwise agreed upon in writing. So if you're buying a plot of land and there are old tires on there or a boat that's been covered by trees for years, it is the seller's obligation to remove all of that. So just keep that in mind. If you are taking lot and land listings, this is something you would want to advise them to do. Now, it can't always be stricken from this, right? Removed from this. Stricken, thank you. Stricken from this. But it is important, if you've got a buyer who's just not going to budge on that, you just want to make sure your seller knows. All right, so then they've changed where they've added that earnest money will be paid by PM on blank date. They will have the blank in there. Again, that was just an option that was added. If earnest money is not delivered by agreed upon date, seller may terminate this contract by delivering notice of termination to the buyer. So that was just added to it before. Now it's may, doesn't have to. It's a little vague. If you don't do it, a lot of people push back on that should something go wrong. So it's always the seller's option. Okay. Paragraph 6 basically just changed the verbiage to map out what the transaction costs were to match the LLR as far as the licensing law, and to have it match what the costs were covered in each one. Also did change it up to all costs obtained to obtain information. This is now negotiable between the buyer and the seller. Always keep in mind that if they do not check the box, it will be added to the seller's transaction costs. Super important on this to make sure that if you've got someone who's owned property for a while, that may be subject to any sort of association, property owners association fees that have been voted in, it's super important that they do the research on that. Okay, because if you've got, we've had this a couple of times, you've got a seller that's owned a property for a while. When they bought it, there were none of these fees. They didn't think anything of it. Next thing you know, they get to closing, the HOA has voted in a transaction fee, or excuse me, a contribution fee. And if you don't negotiate it out here, then it defaults to the seller. What we're seeing, which is very interesting, is some confusion. It's a little sidetracked, but this is a good conversation to have, because it's not so much in land as it is in more of the older developments that have had capital contribution fees, Wild Dunes, Daniel Island, a lot of the ones that had larger ones. The HOA docs actually say the buyers will pay a capital contribution fee. Well, keep in mind, that is not a binding document for the buyer. You could argue that it could be, right? I mean, you could argue that they're signing it, saying it is, but most of that's not seen until the contract's not contingent on that. So you need to make sure that your sellers understand that if they put seller in here, it's hard to say the HOA is going to override the document. Okay, so just keep that in mind. All right, so keeping down, special assessments approved prior to closing shall be responsibility of the seller. Anything approved after closing shall be responsibility of the buyer. That cleans up the vague language on that. And then at closing, they remove the percentage, and then whichever is higher, they basically say it's not to exceed a certain amount, and then says, how that's to be allocated. And then unless otherwise agreed in writing, buyer will pay buyer's transaction costs, seller will pay seller's transaction costs. All right, jumping down to financing. Again, the formatting of the new ones will not look like this. These are just the draft ones with the highlights on there. It added the maximum financing percentage in there. It added when the buyer shall apply for financing within a certain date. As we've said before, that doesn't, this is the apply date. I would not leave that for much longer than you need to. Celeste, I see your question. I'll come right back to that. And then basically the pre-final approval, initial approval letter contains no unreasonable credit, income, or asset conditions by blank date. Final loan approval occurs when lender funds loans. Just again, as a reminder, South Carolina's stance on this, the association stance on this, is the final approval for financing is when the loan closes. Okay, so technically the financing contingency lasts through closing. Now, that doesn't mean if the buyer doesn't apply timely, or the buyer goes out and buys a Porsche and messes up their financing, they're not protected in that one, right? But should something come up within without any unreasonable conditions. Same thing with, yes, go ahead.
Sorry. Did you go from a land contract to a home contract?
No, this is on the land contract.
Oh, okay. Because I'm looking to walk through inspection. Okay. So just mean you can walk the land and stuff. Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no problem. Now this one again was added. If the buyer changes their lender during the finance period, they must notify the seller within blank calendar days. This should be short. Absent written approval by the seller, buyer cannot change their lender if the closing date agreed upon in paragraph 4 changes as a direct result. Now this has thrown some confusion to people because they say, well, why did they add that? Because honestly, you have to have obviously that would have to happen because you have to change the closing date, right? Which is true. However, why they did this is it specifies that if you try to change the closing date and then the seller, let's say I'm the buyer, I switch lenders, the new lender is better, may even be faster now because the other one was taking too long, but I still have to change the closing date. Well, the seller doesn't have to accept that. And if they say no, and it's because of switching lenders, this is what protects the seller to say, look, you went out and switched lenders. Like you can't just change the closing date on that. So that's why that's in there. Okay, so Celeste asked a good question on this is what are the best practices in getting the information on capital contributions, if any, prior to listing the property? Just ask the HOA, or this be applicable to add in the property disclosure. So it should be in the property disclosure that there is an association. This, along with many other things, let me see actually. Let me look at something real quick.
I can see this being something kind of forgotten about. So I want to make sure to get ahead of that.
Yeah. So
On the addendum for the HOA, that if you have one, it asks that question specifically. Is there a transfer? There is or is not a transfer charge.
right.
And if you make a form up that you go through with all of your listings, you ask about it specifically. Because most people don't know well, and so you end up calling the HOA offices and stuff like that.
Yeah, and what you want to do, and this is always one I'd always come to this when I'm doing the whole contract is, paragraph 32 in this one, I can't remember which one it is in the other contract. It specifically states your role as the agent in this, which is not the HOA person. It's not an inspector. It's not the county courthouse. It's not all of these things. So yes, a lot of times it will be pushed back to you to get the information, and you should facilitate that communication. Because what you want to, so in this case, like Karen said, it should be disclosed on the property disclosure. However, if it's been added and the seller doesn't know about it, then obviously there's an issue of, obviously, even they're not trying to conceal it or anything like that. But a buyer may say at this point, after all inspections, well, I never would have purchased the house if I knew I had to pay this, right? So you get that on there. So if you are going to confirm any of this information, always include your seller in that communication, right? Don't take on everything yourself. There's a difference between customer service and opening yourself up to major liability. Okay, so in these cases, you want to make sure, Karen, I do understand that you said in here that there is no contribution fee or anything. Love to follow up with the HOA. I'm happy to email them. I'll copy you on there if you have a great contact info. Have all that on there to get a response. So you have it from someone other than just word of mouth from the seller. Again, this doesn't have anything to do with the seller trying to do anything wrong. What happens most of the time is exactly what you just said. It's forgotten by the seller, or it's happened and the seller doesn't know. Right? I mean, how many of us live in an HOA right now could safely say you don't know if something like that has been voted in? I mean,
And
for the most part.
And sometimes they don't want to talk to you. They want to talk to the seller.
Correct. All right, so let's jump back on. And again, for those of you that are joining and haven't been to a contracts class before, this is a review of changes. If you're overwhelmed, don't be, and just know that keep coming to contracts classes. We'll keep going.
Joseph, this is Mahalia. Before you move further, just making sure that I understand the HOA. Wouldn't we just contact the HOA president of that community and find out whether or not there's any fees? I mean, how would we go about getting documentation to ensure that someone has complied with that residents of HOA and don't owe a fee?
Yeah, so part of that, and I go back to what Karen was saying, is I would have part of my listing checklist when I'm taking that listing to say confirm HOA fees. And so what I would do at that point is I would get the contact information from the seller, or have the seller reach out, or you reach out and copy the seller on there. It's not often the HOA president. They're actually normally the worst ones to get the information from.
Okay.
It's typically the property manager, should they have one, unless it's so for our neighborhood, we don't have a property manager. We have like very informal officers. So yes, you'd get it from that HOA president, but for the most part, they're always going to defer to the property manager.
Okay, all right, thanks. I just wanted.
But yes, succinct answer to your question is yes. You would want to get as much of that ahead of time as you could.
Again, build that into the listing
Correct.
checklist that you have. Is there a property manager?
Yes. 100%. And always on these, if you end up having the phone conversation, have an email follow-up, right? Karen, it was great talking to you. Thank you for the information. This is just to confirm that there is a capital contribution fee of X. If you will, please reply just to make sure I understood you correctly.
Okay, just to have a paper trail. Okay, great.
All right, so scooting down to the next change on this one is in paragraph 8 under inspection, reinspection. Basically, the seller is granting the buyer a right to perform final walkthrough inspection of property within 48 hours prior to the closing date. A couple things on this. Now, one, I don't want to bounce around and confuse people more. However, because Karen had mentioned, is this a form 310 versus 330? No, it's the same one. Keep in mind, though, that this is specifically stated in both contracts that unless otherwise agreed upon, the buyer doesn't have the right to do a final walkthrough until within 48 hours of closing. So if you make sure everyone understands, if you're doing any sort of repair amendment or anything like that, if you change that the seller understands that that has to be done, you know, prior to, but then that the buyer understands that this part of the contract says that the buyer can perform the final walkthrough within 48 hours. So there's two separate things. There's repairs and then there's final walkthrough. So the repairs can be done well within a deadline you set, but if you come out to do the inspection 5 days ahead of time, the repairs are done, but the property still needs to be cleaned of debris or whatever it may be, the seller technically has 48 hours from closing to have that final walkthrough done. So just keep that in mind. A couple other small things you'll see throughout highlighted where they've changed within 5 calendar days. They've just added calendar to specify. Due diligence basically was a change to completely match it's the exact same due diligence process that was originally stated or that is stated in Form 310. It just is, again, to keep them consistent between the different forms. Now, the difference between this contract and Form 310 is you have all of the other stipulations, deed restrictions, septic, all of those, which quite honestly, I would imagine over the years are just going to be consolidated all under due diligence, which they should be. But whatever the date is here on all of these, you want it to match the time frame of all of the other contingencies. Okay, which are the changes that were then made, were not made, excuse me, I should say, so it makes it a little confusing throughout the rest of the contract. This was added, parties have the right for 14 calendar days after notice. If there's any damage done to the property, then they have 14 calendar days to decide whether or not they're gonna have the seller repair damage, take on the damage themselves, or terminate the contract. Again, all of the permits, rezoning, anything here, for whatever reason, they kept in calendar days. I personally think they should have changed all of these to be dates as well. So you want these to match, just from a protocol standpoint, you'd want these to match due diligence, unless it's just not reasonable to get a building permit within a certain period of time. Or if it's not reasonable to have a rezoning information done within a certain period of time, then you would add more time for that specific one. If this was just removed, if seller receives the delivered notice of termination during the rezoning period, any remaining earnest money shall be returned to the buyer. They removed this only because earnest money, it conflicts with South Carolina law, which basically says earnest money is nothing is done with earnest money without a final signed upon agreement in addition to this document. So this was just removed to remove any confusion on that. Deed restrictions. This one was added to say seller shall provide a copy of any deed restrictions. This kind of goes into the condominium documents and everything, which is, you'll understand my next point why I've kind of been a little vague on the answer about getting the information. Provide it within blank calendar days of the affected date. You want to again, talk to the listing agent, say, you know, how much time do I need? The reason that I kind of had this highlighted and pause on it is one of the points that was made when we were going through this with the state's attorney, with the association's attorney, is he did use this as a reminder to understand that, or to state, how did he word it? I have it on here in my little notes. At least I thought I did. There it is. Pulling deed restrictions and pulling this information, particularly if you're having to go pull it from the county, could be considered gray area on practicing law, which is why I think it's a little much, but also understand that they overly represent the association and the realtors and they want us to protect ourselves. So instead of going as high and to the right on that is why I say just include your seller right in this to make sure they understand that also this is all being communicated, because at the end of the day, here's what happens. Something goes wrong and then they come in and say, well, Joseph said this, and the seller's like, well, I had no idea Joseph was doing any of that, so it's not my responsibility, it's my agent's. You just don't want that to happen. Okay. All right, again, same thing with earnest money, calendar days, same changes. All right, soil and water tests. This does add some verbiage on the soil and water specifically, and the seller attesting to that. Buyer shall be responsible for repair, restoration of any anything that was any damage caused by these inspections. So this just maps out those specific soil and water tests, because what's been happening is people go out, they do a perk test, they do anything there, and it creates some issues if it does come up, who's responsible for solving it, etc. All right, again, striking an earnest money comment. And then I think added specifically on rollback taxes. So this does provide specific provisions should any of the following happen. So the first one is the parties agree that the seller shall pay any rollback taxes at the closing, no later than 5 calendar days prior to the closing date. Seller shall provide any and all information and documentation required by the appropriate taxing authority to assess the rollback taxes on the property. Parties agree that the county assessment estimate for rollback taxes are collected on the closing statement. Represents the final amount for rollback taxes paid by the seller. After the closing, neither party shall have any further duties and responsibilities to the other party related to rollback taxes. This is something that you would want to get the closing attorney involved in on early, right? They'd have this. The other one is the parties agree that the buyer shall pay any rollback taxes whenever the taxes are assessed. Seller has no responsibility for the rollback taxes. Or the parties agree to split the and agree to pay the rollback taxes as follows: blank percent to the buyer, blank percent to the seller. Okay, so again, if you don't know if there are any, if you don't know what this is, obviously this is telling you you've got some due diligence to do ahead of time. A lot of time, this would be part of, as a listing agent, part of something you would want to have on your checklist to have this confirmed. And then as a buyer's agent, you want to reach out, now that you know that this has to be selected this way, you want to reach out and make sure you understand what the options are for the buyer. And then the rest are all changes of calendar date and anything that conflicts. So we've got calendar date, earnest money removal. They did strike this paragraph on any adjustments on special assessments because this was already addressed earlier in the contract. They added to it on when those special assessments would be assessed. And then remove some of the forms that were just didn't make sense to have on here as possible, as possible attachments, because they weren't relevant to land. And then this was added as along with the contract that basically says the offer will expire automatically if no action is taken place, which kind of is already stated that it has expired in there. So a little bit of a redundant statement, but they did it to match the purchase and sale. All right, that was a lot of information. Let me see, I got a question on here. Deed restrictions where an easement disclosure would go. Yeah, that could be part of it. Yep. All right, what else? What other questions you have? All right, so just so everyone knows, moving forward, you obviously can go back, watch this at any time. I'm going to break these down into broker minute videos to have separate ones. I'll probably just do them all and send them out so you can just look at the different ones. I know as much as you love to hear something about contracts again each week, so those will be separated. But also be on the lookout later this week. There has been a small adjustment to the property disclosure. Actually, let me see if I can I'll just pull it really quickly. Listen to this. You get sneak peek information on this and you didn't even know it. All right.
Talk about excitement.
Well, maybe so sneak peek that I don't have access to it yet. So let me. Yeah, they've already updated it. So I think, let me make sure. Yeah. On the property disclosure, let me. So here's the change that's come up on the property disclosure. It's a small one, but an important one. It has to do with the roof. So basically there are two sections now: is the approximate year that the current roof cover was installed, right? So if they had a new roof put on, the approximate year the structure was built, so they know if there's a difference between the two. And they've added a separate line that says, during your ownership, describe any known roof leaks, repairs, or modifications with the dates. So this, what it does is it basically specifies the difference between a roof being repaired, a roof being replaced, and when the original roof was put on. Because the issue that was coming up from that is someone would have, in the old property disclosure, they'd say roof repaired, a certain date. It wasn't real clear as to when the actual current roof was on, because the buyer would have just put in there that, hey, they had roof work done. It was a little vague. So that's the change on that. All right. Any other questions? Questions in general?
Joseph, if you're selling land and you get an offer from, and the agent uses the home offer contract, 310 or whatever the number is.
Yeah.
What would you do with that?
I'd counter on 330.
No. What I'm saying is if they use the wrong form, I'm selling land and the agent is
Right.
putting in an offer and they're using the other form, a house form.
Yeah. I would counter on the proper form.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, you could here's the other thing you can do. You could argue, this may be me. You could choose however you would like to handle it. If it were me, I'd say, Patty, thank you. We are going to look at it, just so you know, we're going to counter on form 330. So we keep it on the proper form. Some of you may say push back and make Patty change it. I don't know. I think you're kind of wasting some bandwidth in that relationship by doing that.
Okay.
Personally.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I would just counter on that.
Okay, good.
And then say, Patty, I know an excellent company that you can join that does their contracts classes are amazing. Never would have made this mistake had you been at this company.
Exactly.
Other questions? That's it. Super exciting. All right, I will also send out, if you go to SC Forms or screaltors.org/forms, these highlighted changes are on there. You've got them, so you can just print them out just to reference them if you want to. There's also some good videos on there as well. But just let me know if you have any questions.
Thank
All right,
you.
everyone. Have a great.
Okay, goodbye, everyone. Thanks, Joseph, for the information.
Go ahead.
No, I said thank you for the information. It's a lot.
Absolutely. Call me if you have any questions.
I will.
Thank you, Joseph.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Joseph.